The story about childhood secret love really excites me. I'm sure you will love it too.
The morning Clara Hawthorne signed her name on a marriage certificate, she told herself it was just a practical decision. The kind a sensible woman makes when the bank is circling her father's land like a patient vulture, and there are no other options left on the table. She didn't marry Thomas Weller for love. She didn't even marry him for hope. She married him because he asked, because he was decent enough, and because she had run out of time. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Thomas Weller had been waiting for exactly this moment for 15 years. Clara was 31, sharp-eyed, and quietly exhausted in the way that women who carry too much for too long often are. She had spent the last 3 years nursing her ailing father, managing what remained of the Hawthorne homestead outside of Millhaven, and deflecting the pity of neighbors who meant well, but made everything heavier. When Thomas came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands and a straightforward proposal, she had studied him the way you study a contract, looking for the catch. He was calm, measured. He spoke plainly and asked for nothing extravagant. He said he would settle her father's debts, maintain the land, and expect only an honest partnership in return. No grand promises, no declarations. Just a quiet arrangement between two reasonable people. Well, she said yes before he finished his second cup of coffee. Their wedding was small, a preacher, 2 witnesses, and a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and sun. Thomas wore a clean shirt and spoke his vows without stumbling. Clara wore her mother's dress and kept her eyes forward. When it was done, they rode back to the homestead in a wagon with 3 feet of bench between them and the sound of the horses filling the silence neither of them tried to break. She told herself it would be fine. I'm manageable. She had managed harder things. But that first evening, something small unsettled her. She was moving a crate of her belongings into the back room when she passed the parlor and noticed Thomas standing still in front of the fireplace mantel. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking at the old family portrait her father had commissioned years ago. Clara, as a young girl of maybe 14, seated beside her parents with her hair pinned back and her chin slightly lifted the way the photographer had instructed. She almost asked him what he was looking at. But something in the stillness of his shoulders stopped her. She moved on and said nothing. The first 2 weeks of the marriage were polite and uneventful. Thomas was up before dawn every morning, working the land with a steadiness that Clara had to admit she respected. He ate what she cooked without complaint, and helped with her father's care without being asked, and kept his word on every practical matter he had promised. He was not cold exactly, but he was careful, measured in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a man who had decided long ago how much of himself he was willing to show. She found herself watching him sometimes without meaning to. It was her father who first said something strange. He was having a clear-headed afternoon. He's sitting up in bed with better color in his face than he'd had in weeks. Clara was changing the dressing on his hand when he looked toward the doorway and said, almost to himself, "He turned out all right. I always wondered if he would." "Who did?" Clara asked. Her father blinked and looked at her as if surprised she was there. "Thomas," he said simply. Then he closed his eyes and drifted back toward sleep before she could ask what he meant. She stood there a long moment, gauze still in her hands. Her father had spoken about Thomas as if he knew him from somewhere, from before. But that made no sense. Thomas Weller had come to Millhaven only 2 years ago from somewhere up north, or so she had been told. He was not a man with deep roots in town. Nobody seemed to know much about him, and he didn't offer much either. She let it go. Her father had confused moments. It likely meant nothing. But 3 days later, Out she was cleaning out the old barn to make room for Thomas's tools when her boot caught the edge of a loose floorboard near the back wall. She knelt to press it back down and felt it give differently than it should. She pulled it up. Underneath, nestled in the dry dark, was a small tin box. It was old, the kind that might have once held tobacco or sewing needles, but it was not empty. She could feel the weight of something inside before she even opened it. And she sat back on her heels in the dust and hay and looked at that box for a long moment. Something told her that whatever was inside would not be simple. She was right. The tin box had no lock, just a lid pressed tight from years of sitting undisturbed beneath a barn floor that had not been touched since before Clara could remember. She worked the edge with her thumbnail until it gave with a soft pop, and then she sat very still for a moment before she looked inside. Letters, a stack of them, folded and tied with a piece of plain twine that had gone brittle with age. She counted them without thinking. 11, 12. She lost count and started again. 15 in all, give or take, each one folded with the same careful hand. No envelopes, no postage. They had never been sent. She lifted the top one slowly and unfolded it. The handwriting was young, uneven in places, like someone still learning how to form letters with confidence. But the words themselves were not the words of a child. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to let you. But I saw you at the creek today, and you laughed at something your mother said, and I thought, I want to remember that laugh for the rest of my life. Clara stopped reading. She sat in the dust of that old barn, with hay pressing into her knees, and the afternoon light coming in sideways through the gap in the wall, and she read that line again. Then she looked at the bottom of the letter for a name. Just one letter. But it sat there on the page like a stone dropped in still water. She told herself it could be anyone. T was a common enough initial. This box could have belonged to someone who worked the land before her family. A hand, a tenant, a traveler who sheltered here once and left something behind. There were a dozen reasonable explanations, and she lined them up in her mind like fence posts. But her hands were not steady when she reached for the next letter. This one was dated. The year was 16 years back, which would have made Clara 15. The handwriting was slightly more controlled, like a year of practice had settled something in the writer. Your father let me muck the stalls today. You brought water out to the hands around midday, and you didn't look at me once. I don't blame you. I'm nobody worth looking at. But I stayed an extra hour just in case you came back. Clara lowered the letter slowly. Found she had no memory of a boy working their stalls when she was 15. But then, she had been 15, distracted and self-concerned the way all 15-year-olds are, more interested in the books she borrowed from the schoolhouse than in the faces of the hands her father hired for seasonal work. There had been boys. There were always boys drifting through during harvest season, working for a few weeks before moving on. She had paid them very little attention. Someone had paid her a great deal. She didn't read the rest of the letters that afternoon. She folded the two she had opened as carefully as she had found them, placed them back in the box, and pressed the lid closed. Then she stood up, tucked the box under her arm, walked back to the house, and put it on the shelf in her room behind a stack of her father's old ledgers, where it would not be immediately visible. Out she went about the rest of the evening as if nothing had happened. She made supper. She checked on her father. She set 2 plates on the table and sat across from Thomas and watched him eat with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. And she thought about the letter. I stayed an extra hour just in case you came back. Did you grow up around here? She asked, keeping her voice level. Thomas looked up from his plate. Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and controlled. I passed through this part of the territory when I was young, he said. Worked some ranches. Which ones? He was quiet for a moment. Few different ones. It was a long time ago. He didn't offer more, and she didn't push. But she noticed that he didn't say no. He didn't say he had never been here before. He said it was a long time ago, and left the door neither open nor closed, which told her something in itself. She slept poorly that night. But over the next several days, she read the letters one at a time, spacing them out like she was rationing something she wasn't sure she should have found at all. They spanned years. The early ones were written by a boy who was clearly young and uncertain, someone working nearby and watching from a respectful distance, never approaching, never presuming. The tone was not obsessive. It was not frightening. And it was something closer to longing so carefully contained that it had nowhere to go but onto paper that was never meant to be read. As the years passed in the letters, the handwriting matured. The words became quieter, less urgent, but somehow heavier for it. One letter, written what appeared to be 8 or 9 years ago, said only this: "I heard you're doing well. That's enough. It has to be." Clara read that one 3 times. She found herself thinking about Thomas differently after that, but not with suspicion exactly, but with a careful attention she hadn't brought to him before. She started noticing small things, the way he always made sure the parlor fire was going before she came downstairs in the morning, the way he had, without being asked, moved her father's chair closer to the window where the old man liked to watch the yard, the way he never asked anything of her, not conversation, not warmth, and not even acknowledgement, as if he had long ago made peace with receiving nothing in return. It unnerved her in a way she could not fully name. And then, on a quiet Thursday evening, she came downstairs to find Thomas sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. He wasn't writing. He was just sitting there, pen resting between his fingers, eyes on the middle distance. When he heard her step, he folded the paper quickly and slid it beneath his hand. Not quickly enough. She had seen enough of the handwriting to recognize it. She stood in the doorway and said nothing. He said nothing. The fire crackled between them, like it was the only honest thing in the room. She turned and went back upstairs without a word. She lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, the tin box on the shelf just a few feet away, and asked herself a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. What do you do when the stranger you married turns out to be someone who has known you longer than almost anyone alive? She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She drifted in and out of something shallow and restless, and each time she surfaced, she was aware of the tin box on the shelf and the question she had taken to bed with her that still had no answer by morning. She was already downstairs when Thomas came in from the yard. Boots dusty and shirt damp from the early work he always started before the sun had fully committed to the day. He stopped when he saw her at the table. She had the tin box in front of her, lid off, the letters stacked beside it. She had not planned it this way. She had woken up and come downstairs, and somewhere between the kitchen and the table, the decision had simply made itself. Thomas looked at the box for a long moment. His face did not collapse or flood with panic the way she half expected. He just looked at it, the way a man looks at something he always knew would eventually surface. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. "How long were you here?" she finally asked. "When we were young?" "2 summers," he said. "I was 13 the first time, 14 the second." Clara looked at him. She was doing the arithmetic without meaning to. That made him 30 now. She had never thought to ask his age before. It hadn't seemed important. "You worked for my father." "Yes." "He knew who you were. When he said you turned out all right, he remembered you." Thomas nodded once. I came back through Millhaven about 2 years ago. I stopped to see if the land was still in your family's name. Your father recognized me. We talked." He paused. He told me things were difficult." Something moved through Clara's chest that she couldn't immediately identify. "So he knew," she said. "When you came to the house with your proposal, he knew it was you." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Her father, in all his careful quietness, had opened the door and said nothing to her. She wasn't sure yet whether she was grateful or something closer to angry. "The letters," she said. She didn't ask a question. She just said it. Thomas looked at the stack of folded papers on the table. "I left them under that floorboard the second summer I worked here. I didn't know why exactly. I was 14 and I had no one to give them to, and nowhere else to put what I was feeling." He paused. "I never thought they'd still be there. Did you come back for them?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came back for a lot of things," he said carefully. Retrieving those letters was not the first thing on my mind." It was the closest he had come to saying something plainly, and the plainness of it landed differently than she expected. She looked at him across the table, this man she had studied like a contract and married like a practical arrangement, and tried to reconcile him with the 14-year-old boy who had stayed an extra hour just in case she came back to the yard. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly," she said. "All right. Did you propose to me because you pitied my situation, or because you wanted to?" Thomas met her eyes without flinching. "Both things can be true," he said. "Your situation was real, and it needed addressing. But I won't sit here and tell you the reason I came back to Millhaven had nothing to do with you. That would be a lie, and you deserve better than that." Clara looked down at the table. Outside, a morning bird was making noise in the elm tree by the fence, and somewhere further out, one of the horses shifted in the paddock. The world was going about its ordinary business, while she had here but trying to figure out what to do with a truth she hadn't asked for, and wasn't sure she was equipped to hold. "I don't know how to feel about this," she said quietly. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said since they met. "You don't have to know yet," Thomas said. "I'm not asking you for anything, Clara. I never was." She looked up at him and dabbed at him. "That's the part I keep coming back to," she said. "You never asked for anything. Not once. Most men who want something make sure you feel the weight of it." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile. More like a man who had carried something a long time and was only now setting it down in the light where it could be seen. "I spent a long time understanding that wanting something doesn't give you a claim to it," he said. "You were never mine to want. You were just someone I couldn't stop thinking about regardless." Clara stood up from the table, but not because she was leaving, but because she needed to move. She walked to the window and stood there looking out at the yard, at the land that bore her family's name, at the fence Thomas had mended in the first week without being asked. She thought about the letters, not the words in them exactly, but the years between them. The long silences where he had simply lived his life somewhere out there and written nothing, because there was nothing to say except that he was still thinking of. The letter that said, "I heard you're doing well." That's enough. It has to be. A person didn't write something like that out of obsession. They wrote it out of a love so long resigned to itself that it had stopped asking for anything and started simply existing. Like weather, like seasons, like something that doesn't need permission to continue. She turned around. "I found 2 letters I haven't read yet," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then read them when you're ready, or don't." That they weren't written to be found. "But they were found," she said. "And I think we both have to decide what to do with that." She crossed the room and picked up the tin box and held it for a moment. Then she set it back down on the table, in the space between them. and sat back down across from him. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to have supper together tonight and actually talk. Not about the land or the debts or my father's care. Just talk. But like two people who are trying to know each other." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like that," he said quietly. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution or a turning point dressed up in fine language. It was just two people at a table with a tin box of old letters between them and the slow, cautious beginning of something that had no guaranteed outcome. But for the first time since she had signed her name on that marriage certificate, the Clara Hawthorne did not feel like she was simply managing a situation. She felt like she was in one. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not entirely mind. The tin box stayed on the table for 3 days before either of them moved it. By then, they had talked enough that neither of them needed to open it again.